that they can get control over perceptions of legitimacy, because perceptions of legitimacy will determine how many pieces they can deploy on the chessboard to orchestrate a potential coup. But what I'm getting at here is around that time, Jeff Bezos, it came out publicly that he had been actually reading right-wing, sort of new right literature. So they need to find a new cover in order to centralize this censorship leviathan they've already created. Total destabilization, shutdown of the federal highways, occupation of federal buildings, Molotov cocktails in police cars, burning down police precincts, surrounding the White House. There was a chilling anarcho-tyranny. If they do that this time, it could be a game changer from what we had last time.
With us now is the executive director for the Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benz. Mike, good to see you.
Great to see you, Liz. Thanks for having me.
All right, Mike, I want to talk about election integrity with you today because you have some predictions about what's going to happen as it relates to the certification of the Electoral College this year, or I suppose it'll be in January of next year, but this election cycle. But before we get to that, there's been a video that I think has been underreported out of the Biden administration. This is Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, who was holding a town hall, but for his own employees, essentially. And a woman comes up to the microphone and asks him about the creation or the potential creation of what she calls an information czar. This supposed or this information czar that is yet to be created would essentially be, right, you can get to that in a moment, would essentially be someone who oversees quote unquote disinformation online. So our audience knows that oftentimes what we talk about in the show, big tech labels as disinformation. Big tech is controlled by big government. So I want to show this video, and then I'd like to hear your reaction for what's going on behind the scenes here. If we could take a look at this.
As you just said, research that I've done at the War College indicates that our interagency response to information warfare by foreign actors is insufficient and not very well coordinated. So given state actors like Russia are so good at this, how can we enhance our capabilities using influence AI to both identify disinformation and create our own narratives? And since you just talked about breaking down silos, what do you think about the idea of having sort of an information czar, maybe at the National Security Council, or another actor that will have sort of an overall view on protecting information resiliency in our domestic environment? Thanks.
It's a good question on the information czar. One challenge, just to be straightforward, is that a lot of these questions around information operations, around public diplomacy, around the voice that America uses to speak to the world, bleed over into questions of propaganda or politics. And so the question is, should the White House be the central locus for this effort, or should it actually be distributed to an agency? Should this be a case where you have a lead agency model? One agency is in charge and they're sort of running it, but it's kept one step removed from the White House. I think on the czar, that's something we've been grappling with and thinking about. Across the national security enterprise and under NSM2, most decision-making does get kind of brought into the NSC process. But this may be an area where actually a lead agency model is a more effective way of setting up for long-term success that insulates this from the twos and fro's of politics on both sides. That's not just, by the way, about the election interference issues. It's about the larger question of how we decide messages we communicate, how we decide what messages we combat, which are fraught.
Mike, please give me your take on this, because it's hard to know. I feel like we could break this down sentence by sentence, and every single phrase out of his mouth is deeply troubling.
Yeah, the whole thing here is an elaborately constructed lie on Jake Sullivan's part, but you have to understand the fine line he's walking here. So we already have multiple U.S. agencies who are already doing this, but it's a little bit clumsy right now. Let me walk through the history a little bit. So in 2014, we set up a lead agency, an information czar, to govern social media speech. It was called the Global Engagement Center out of the State Department. And it was set up so that the U.S. government could tell social media companies what kind of ISIS groups to censor online. Basically, it did this AI influence scraping that the lady from the U.S. Army War College, which, by the way, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on developing these AI scan and ban technologies. So that was originally created by DARPA, this AI natural language processing technique that she's referring to. in order to determine people who talked like ISIS on Facebook and Twitter, what kind of words, prefixes, suffixes they used, hashtags. And then the Global Engagement Center would serve as an information czar to Facebook, to YouTube, and Twitter, and tell them what accounts, what networks, what slogans, what hashtags to ban. That was set up in 2014 under a sort of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency program. The issue was then 2016 happened. 2016 saw Brexit, which the U.S. State Department hotly contested and tried to stop. And then it saw the election of Donald Trump, which was basically the end of the grand vision that the State Department had at the time towards Atlanticism. And so what they did is they took all this infrastructure they already had at state for countering terrorism and insurgency and simply put it under their pro-democracy banner for counter-populism. Counter-populism in the U.S., counter-populism in Brazil with Bolsonaro, counter-populism in France with Marine Le Pen, counter-populism in Italy with Matteo Salvini, in Spain with the Vox Party, in Germany with the AfD Party. It became the entire world. You could control and censor speech in every country on God's green earth, because if there was a populist party who was rising to power or who was popular on social media, the State Department had a channel to tell the social media companies to ban everything they said, all of their key accounts and networks and amplifiers. And then they started getting into some trouble around this that basically went off without a hitch, where the State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Department of Defense, and our intelligence services all worked in concert, building that censorship technology that was referred to in the first part there, and then centralizing it under the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. Interestingly, that was set up by a guy named Rick Stengel, who was the former managing editor of Time magazine. He proudly called himself Obama's propagandist-in-chief. He was the Undersecretary for Public Affairs. As soon as Trump won the election and he was ousted from office at the State Department, he wrote an op-ed and then a full book calling for the end of the First Amendment, despite his previous job being exporting it, because social media can lead to people like Donald Trump being elected. And he is currently, by the way, on the board of advisors for NewsGuard, one of the largest for-profit censorship firms in the world. NewsGuard, by the way, who just targeted Zero Hedge and a dozen other folks, along with the whole Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Media Matters push just this week. But fast forward to what Jake Sullivan's response to the question was, and he was saying, we're looking at this very closely right now. The blob is still in the aftermath of this Disinformation Governance Board disaster from 2022. So
Scary
a lot of
Poppins. We remember her.
Yes, right. Now, a lot of people were saying that was a Ministry of Truth that was being created at DHS. And technically, the folks who said it wasn't were correct. It was not, the Disinformation Governance Board was not the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Truth was already there at DHS. It was called CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, tucked in some nebbish, insular sub-agency of DHS that no one had ever heard of. But it had already been working to censor the internet domestically, targeting tens of millions of Trump tweets and YouTube videos, all under this banner initially of stopping Trumpism because it was backed by Russia. And so this is another dirty trick, by the way, that Jake Sullivan is leaving unstated here. This is all under the banner of stopping foreign influence. But then all they need to do is have a rogue intelligence assessment that foreign country is supporting Donald Trump. And then what they do is they say, well, listen, even if it came from a U.S. citizen, it's being amplified over there. So therefore, it's part of a Russian campaign. And so therefore, we get to use the CIA or the DOD or the State Department or USAID to cram down on the social media companies to force the censorship of this narrative, of this news cycle, of this political network, because it's beneficial to a hostile foreign adversary. This is the dirty trick they use to get jurisdiction over every American tweet, despite us supposed to be having a First Amendment protection. But essentially what's happening here is they got in trouble with the Disinformation Governance Board centralizing this. Right now, every major national security equity in our entire panoply, state, USAID, DOD, CIA, NSA, and then all the funded swarm army of NGOs and for-profit firms that do the contracting work for that, it's a big mess right now because DOD makes its own determination about what to censor. So does state. So does USAID. This is like a sort of, if you recall, there was a funny situation in Syria in 2016 where CIA-backed paramilitaries were fighting DOD-backed paramilitaries. And so you had the CIA sponsoring one side and the DOD sponsoring the other side, and sometimes they conflict. And sometimes the social media companies get conflicting. So there's no centralization of that. And when they tried to centralize that at DHS, they got in a lot of political trouble over it. So what he's proposing to do is to remove this from the political process by, instead of having the typical coordinator of all of these, the National Security Council do it, they'll park it away at state or USAID or DOD. And already the main one that they set up to do this at state, the Global Engagement Center, is reeling politically because it was crushed during the Twitter files. Because it turned out when the Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Twitter files were published, and then it was put on a jumbotron in front of Jim Jordan, and they were sued multiple times in multiple lawsuits, both by state AG-led actions and by private lawsuits. So they're under a lot of fire. So they need to find a new cover in order to centralize this censorship leviathan they've already created.
Okay, guys, let's talk about health insurance. Health insurance is awful. It's confusing. It's expensive. It's frustrating. Did you know that 1 in 5 Obamacare claims were denied last year, even though you paid your premium? Even though you thought having insurance would give you coverage when you needed it, it doesn't. And it's unacceptable. The headache of health insurance is exactly why Crowd Health was created. Crowd Health is not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. Let me explain to you how this works, because I cannot stand dealing anymore with health insurance. But with Crowd Health, it is a totally different experience. For $175 for an individual, or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you will get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, to discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. And of course, you'll join the crowd, a group of members just like you and me who want to help each other pay for unexpected medical events. You don't have to deal with health insurance to still have the assurance that you won't have to face the financial catastrophe of medical events yourself. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. And compare that, by the way, to how much you are paying per month for your health insurance premiums. Then go to joincrowdhealth.com and use my promo code Liz. The mandatory disclaimer here is Crowd Health is not insurance. You can learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. Joincrowdhealth.com. Use my promo code Liz. Okay, so you mentioned an individual who was in charge of the Global Engagement Center. This in 2014, when this happened, that was during the Obama administration. Who individually or what organization is primarily behind this effort to create a censorship apparatus in our government?
Well, it's still the U.S. State Department, but there's several nodes for it. So first of all, you have several nodes at state. The Global Engagement Center is still around. What they've done is they've delegated much of this to USAID's Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance apparatus. Now, it's important for folks to understand USAID is not an aid organization. Do not be fooled by the name. It is the Agency for International Development, not aid. And its goal is to internationally develop assets for the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency to use to advance our foreign policy goals. For example, if we want to acquire resources or extract resources from a certain region, if we want a military base in a certain region, if we want a certain region to vote a certain way at the UN, if we want to expand private enterprise, or if we want cheap labor markets, if we want export markets for our own goods and services, we need to develop political vassalage control over foreign countries' governments, or at least an influence mechanism to influence the course of events inside foreign countries. And so in order to do that, you need institutions on the ground in that country who are able to effectively take control over that government or exercise influence on it. Those capacities have to be capacity built with money, with training, with resources, with personnel. And that is the role of U.S. aid. It is to capacity build those institutions, to fund them. Now, U.S. aid gets $50 billion a year. And the thing that they have pivoted hardest to in the past 5 years has been the creation of censorship institutions in foreign countries in order to move forward censorship legislation and censorship activity in those countries. So, for example, it played a massive role in the Brazil censorship story that targeted Elon Musk. It was USAID which capacity built a network of hundreds of different indigenous Brazilian institutions, Brazilian universities, Brazilian newspapers, Brazilian fact-checking organizations, Brazilian judiciary clerks, Brazilian parliamentarians, Brazilian prosecutors, all to push anti-misinformation bills at the national parliament level, anti-misinformation prosecutions at the legal level, anti-misinformation sort of inflaming it as a sociocultural issue in Brazil, and working directly with the TSE censorship court with de Moraes, the Voldemort, Chief Justice of the censorship court there, in order to kill the ability to host pro-Bolsonaro content on Facebook, YouTube, X, as well as Telegram and WhatsApp. That all came from USAID, the department. It's the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance thing. That is the main money node for all of this. And on the domestic side, there's the National Science Foundation, which provides over $100 million under the Biden administration to American university centers. They'll call them disinformation labs or disinformation studies research. That is a lie. They're censorship operations, active censorship operations disguised as passive disinformation research in order to kill the rise of political populist movements like Donald Trump here in the U.S., or those of his perceived allies internationally, from here to Brazil to Western Europe, all the way into Hungary and beyond. And so there are all of these different centers. I mean, again, National Science Foundation, DARPA, state, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy. You have at the university level, you have over 100 U.S. universities who get funding from the Pentagon and the State Department and the NSF to do this. You also have thousands of NGOs, gongos, government-organized, government-funded, non-governmental organizations who serve as pawns on the State Department's chessboard in order to get things like the EU Digital Services Act passed, this major Europe-wide censorship law that is threatening to carve up Elon Musk's entire portfolio of corporate assets if he does not censor effectively what NATO tells him to censor, including those political groups that I just mentioned. So the issue is because all of these are parked nominally in their different silos, state, DOD, NSF, USAID, they're having to do a clumsy consensus building process now, which is that they all meet at the Atlantic Council. They all meet at Brookings. They all meet at the Aspen Institute. They have these big stakeholder conferences. They'll fly 200 people to London. They'll spend 3 days there, and they'll talk about what the initiatives are, what the branding terms, what the targets are, and then they all go back. They meet. They continue to trade white papers, but it's a clumsy, slow process, and they want to be able to do it instantly in real time so that no one on the other side has a chance to access hearts and minds in order to oppose them. And that's their current struggle is the centralization process.
This year's election is about so much more than politics. It's about securing our borders, protecting our communities, ensuring that when disasters strike, we have a government that actually shows up for its people and not itself. So first and foremost, on election day, please cast your vote. But also, on election night, you are going to want to be a member of Blaze TV so you can join me and all the other Blaze TV hosts in our coverage of the 2024 presidential election. We are at a crossroads. The future of our nation is being decided in real time right now. This is your chance to be part of something amazing. This election night, Blaze TV is going to have boots on the ground across the country with our correspondents delivering the pulse of the night, straight from where the action is happening. All you have to do is subscribe and you can experience this pivotal night with us. At Blaze TV, we speak the truth. No spin, no filters, just real talk, breaking down what's happening in real time. We'd like to have you with us. Just go to blazeelection.com/Liz and you can get $40 off. That's blazeelection.com/Liz for $40 off. So what we're going to face here then is, even though this ostensibly, whether it's state or whether it's U.S., aid, those are supposed to be organizations that work outside of the United States. It's not supposed to be here domestically that those agencies are used against us or against anything, really. But what's going to happen is they're going to be turned against us because they're going to use as justification for being used domestically this false accusation that, oh, we're just Russian assets, for example. You're just parroting talking points that Vladimir Putin wants to use to influence the election, and that's cheating. And so they're going to use it domestically under the justification of it being foreign propaganda that they're stopping. But I mean, how bad do you foresee this being? I mean, right now, whether it's on YouTube, we face a ton of censorship. You talk about COVID, you talk about transgenderism, you talk about election integrity, you talk about anything that kind of contradicts, quote unquote, the experts. And I mean, I don't have to tell you this. You get suffocated algorithmically, you get demonetized, you get strikes against your channel, you get booted outright. What is that going to look like if this is taken to the next step and that power that you describe is actually centralized?
Well, it's going to look like there's no quarter for it. And that's been disrupted by Elon Musk's acquisition of X and by Mark Zuckerberg's turn against some of this. They were talking about this a year ago, that Mark Zuckerberg had already fired many of the, quote, relationships it took us years to develop. I posted a video on my X channel. It's at Mike Benz Cyber of 5 of the top heavyweights in the censorship industry in September 2023, who were talking about how while everyone was talking about Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg was sort of taking cover in the free speech movement around that to fire many of the sort of CIA intermediaries, State Department relationships that had been developed over the course of years in order to have a pliable liaison within Facebook or Instagram that would censor whatever the State Department wanted them to. And so, they have this new issue, which is that this whole thing relied on this connective tissue between the big national security state and the big tech companies that was created through carrots and sticks, essentially rewarding them with favors from the State Department, fighting for them against international laws, preserving their foreign markets abroad, and by threatening them with regulation, with breaking them up, and with not fighting for them unless they did the censorship. But then you had a principles-based breakthrough with Elon Musk, who said, fine, bankrupt the company. The world will watch, but this is a free speech zone now. And then you have Mark Zuckerberg, who's remonetizing a lot of accounts that had been demonetized, and is making some pretty breakthrough progress. Even just last week, the oversight committee at the oversight board at Meta basically apologized and censured itself for having censored memes that made fun of Kamala Harris. This is the sort of thing that was unthinkable a year or two ago, but is now happening effectively on the daily. And so what they're doing now is they're using this apparatus to coerce the censorship using laws, so that no matter what happens politically, no matter what kind of scandal, no matter if they can't get the liaison tentacles inside the company will be required to under rule of law. And this is what the USAID program, Democracy, Human Rights, and Rule of Law, is about. It's about creating censorship laws in 140 countries. They have a program there which targets to do this in 140 countries in order to redefine what it means to be a State Department compliant democracy in good standing, which is a concept they call digital democracy, which is this idea that whereas from 100 years ago up until 7 years ago, democracy meant freedom of speech. But now you don't have a resilient democracy unless you have anti-misinformation laws in place. And so what they're doing is they're funding judicial activists, they're funding lawyers, they're funding prosecutors, they're funding universities, they're funding media organizations to pass censorship laws in every other country, so there's no quarter for Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg to try to avoid the censorship of the State Department's opponents.
It's terrifying, but I'm actually glad you brought up Mark Zuckerberg, because I wanted to ask you about him and about Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, owner of the Washington Post. We all obviously have been following, I follow it kind of laughingly. I think it's funny what's happening at Washington Post when they, as a newspaper, declined to endorse a presidential candidate for the first time. This is at Jeff Bezos' direction, and their staff just went ballistic, and their readership. Multiple writers for the Washington Post resigned over that. I think something like 200,000 subscribers unsubscribed. I think that was 8% of their total subscription base. So just an absolutely unreal number. What you predicted this, by the way. You were maybe one of the only people that, I think, was it last year? You can tell me the exact date. You said, keep an eye on Jeff Bezos because I think that he's being red-pilled. This is someone who has hobnobbed with the most powerful leftists and globalists around the world. So it's somewhat stunning to see. I don't know how much he's red-pilled. I don't know his motivation for it, but give me your analysis of both he and Mark Zuckerberg. These were very powerful players in the pockets of leftists. What is causing this change, and how much do you think it's going to impact what's going on politically in our country?
And remember, this is not an uncommon story for billionaires or oligarchs to go through this process where they are sort of inside the machine, working with it for years, and then over the process of time, they become disenchanted or isolated, or they feel that they're getting run over despite having been sort of good global citizens for it. You can argue that Elon Musk went through a similar transformation. Elon Musk was a major military and effectively an intelligence contractor. When I was at the State Department, SpaceX had a big role, big seat at the table when it came to all things telecom. Elon Musk effectively was able to start SpaceX because of the CIA and State Department working to get him, the necessary, rocket technology. You had the State Department and CIA effectively overthrow the government of Bolivia several years ago to get access to the lithium, in part because lithium is one of the two major components, along with cobalt and several other resources, for the Tesla green, the renewable battery technology that made America sort of the best in class in terms of, the renewable battery promise of the electricity revolution. And Elon was touted as a sort of left-wing hero because of his technological breakthroughs that would allow a green revolution to be built on some of this technology that he's done. But I think he became disenchanted through a number of things, his own sort of classical liberal beliefs in free speech. And then, from what he said publicly, what happened to one of his children around the transgender agenda, I think really changed his life. I think for Jeff Bezos, much of this started happening around the unionization process at Amazon. Amazon was in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the left-wing labor forces trying to unionize Amazon factory warehouses. And Bezos, despite siding with the Democrats for a very, very long time, the Democrats, I think he felt, betrayed them by siding with the unions and trying to force Amazon into these collective bargaining agreements because all the major unions are giant Democrat Party donors. Actually, a similar thing happened with Elon Musk and the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, who I should note works closely with the CIA abroad. But maybe a story for another time. But what I'm getting at here is around that time, Jeff Bezos, it came out publicly that he had been actually reading right-wing, sort of new right literature. Many of the publications that I believe are either funded or associated with Peter Thiel that were sort of rising in popularity on social media. There was a Vanity Fair piece about Jeff Bezos, about this group, and Jeff Bezos put on his personal Twitter about a year and a half ago that he found this article to be very interesting, very eye-opening. He hadn't seen things like that before. And when somebody in the thick of a management versus labor battle puts publicly, Jeff Bezos only has one tweet on his entire Twitter account this whole year, by the way, and it was right after Donald Trump got shot in the face in Butler, Pennsylvania, and he basically wished the president good health. I mean, that should say something by itself. He has one tweet all year, and it's
praised him. He praised him. He called him either courageous or stalwart, or he conveyed that he was impressed with Donald Trump's reaction to having been shot. It was a very complimentary tweet.
He also personally moved from Bill Gates' Seattle to Miami. Miami is now a red city, I will tell you, living here, and also in terms of I think all the official polling. I think it was actually in 2022 in the midterms, Miami-Dade turned red for the first time in its history. But the guy moved his whole life from Seattle to Miami. Everything that he's published on his own X account suggests that he's become legitimately right-wing in the past 3 years. Everything in his own personal experience dealing with the Democrat establishment, it's obvious that he's been disenchanted by that. And then you have the fact that he just published this, in addition to stopping the endorsement at the WAPO level, he personally published an op-ed this week in the Washington Post saying, one of the delivering probably like the harshest medicine you could serve to a journalist or a journalistic institution, which was saying the problem is not them. The problem is not the American people. The problem is actually us, the news media. We've lost their trust, and it's not their fault for not believing us. We're actually not doing a good job as journalists. And so that self-reflection, that came after all of the mass unsubscriptions that you mentioned, although some of those, I should note, just as a last salvo here, are quite funny. For example, on day one, the editor-at-large of the Washington Post resigned and was held up as this sort of martyr figure, and everyone should follow his lead. And that was the headline: Washington Post editor-at-large resigns in outrage over Jeff Bezos' betrayal. But they never really emphasized the guy's name or what he was doing. That was Robert Kagan who resigned, the Washington Post editor-at-large. Who is Robert Kagan? He's the husband of Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland's husband, Robert Kagan, was the editor-at-large at the Washington Post. Victoria Nuland is NATO's angel of death. She was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and then she became the assistant secretary for Europe and Eurasia at the State Department. So she oversaw about 20 different elections every election cycle, and her job as the manager of the State Department's global chessboard of assets is to ensure the correct party wins and loses every single election, and if the wrong party wins, to orchestrate a color revolution to oust that democratically elected government and install a State Department puppet. Basically, in the name of democracy, usurping democracy on every single country covered in her assistant secretary portfolio. I should note that she actually, when she left the State Department, what is she doing now? Well, now she's a board member at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the #1 CIA cutout in the entire swarm army of the Central Intelligence Agency. That agency that she just joined was actually created by the CIA director Bill Casey in 1983 when they tried to get the CIA powers back that they had lost under the Church Committee hearings. So it's one big club.
It's also very telling about how... Right. It's very telling about how effective the mainstream media are as the propaganda arms of the left if the husband of a woman who not only rigs elections abroad but stages color revolutions, as you said, usurping democracy, if her husband resigned, then he must think it's a pretty big deal that that Jeff Bezos, through the Washington Post, is not walking in lockstep anymore with Kamala Harris. That must mean it's a pretty destructive thing that they're facing for their agenda.
It's huge to them, and you can see why. But I should note, I do think this is much bigger than left. I think when it comes to for example, the Bezos union fight, I think that's a fair characterization to say that that's a left-wing thing. Or when he's reading the Vanity Fair piece about the new right and he's getting interested in conservative literature, I think that's correct. That's a left-right thing. But in this case with Robert Kagan has always been known as a neocon, as part of the sort of Bill Kristol. These are, yeah, right. I don't think Robert Kagan is woke, for example. I think that he signs on with the left when it comes to fighting Trumpism because of foreign policy. But in a sense, this is actually as bad as the left-wing wokeism, as bad as left-wing economics, can be. There's a force more powerful than that. And that is this blob permanent Washington apparatus, which can wield the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA and DARPA and the State Department and U.S. aid and tens of thousands of institutional assets across the media and civil society and the universities and the private sector firms in order to create this swarm attack on a political opponent. And that's what Robert Kagan is really tied into there. And what makes what we're up against so terrifying is that this goes to something deeper than the simple traditional partisan thumbie war that happens every 4 years. What we're confronting is at the very sort of center of the inner atrium of the heart of what typically makes American power.
The word you use, terrifying, I think is accurate here. Let me ask you, I said at the beginning, I wanted to ask you about the election and the certification of the Electoral College. You have a prediction. You've essentially predicted that there will be a coup if Donald Trump wins before the certification of the electoral votes in January of 2025. detail what your prediction is and why you think that this will happen.
Well, my prediction is they're going to try it. Whether it works or not, I think will depend on what the mandate is, what the cushion is effectively between. So let's just start with the dates. So we have, November 5th, we've got the vote. January 6th, we have the certification of the vote. Now, there's a group that are calling themselves the State Democracy Defenders. This is Norm Eisen, the legal hatchet man for all of this, the guy who drafted 10 articles of impeachment for Trump, but his first year in office, the guy who led Crew, which sued the Trump administration thousands of times, the guy who led the Trump impeachment process, the guy who led Russiagate, the guy who led the indictments. This is the sort of legal hatchet man for all things killed Trump. He's teamed up with Jamie Raskin, who is the U.S. congressman who led the charge on everything from the January 6th, all of the sort of hoax lawfare that went on around that. But Jamie Raskin has said publicly that it doesn't matter who people vote for in November. Doesn't matter. Trump can win, 350 electoral votes. It doesn't matter because Congress, under Raskin's initiative, is going to not certify a Trump Electoral College victory because they will cancel out the Electoral College votes. They'll nullify Donald Trump at the 11th hour, 2 weeks before inauguration on January 6, 2025, by citing Article 3 of the 14th Amendment to argue that Trump is an insurrectionist, and so he's therefore disqualified from holding office. And what he predicted is at that point, it's going to piss off. Now, he said we shouldn't have had to do this because the Supreme Court, when the ball was in their court several months ago, during the immunity ruling verdict that came down, they should have held that Trump was an insurrectionist then, and then he would have been disqualified already under the 14th Amendment. But he said because the Supreme Court failed to disqualify him, we'll simply make that determination through Congress. But we know that when we do that, the country is going to erupt in what he called civil war conditions. He basically predicted that, Trump militias and paramilitaries and angry street mobs would take to the streets and would try to basically, have some show of outrage or get Trump into office despite Congress nullifying the Electoral College victory. And he said at that point, we're going to need martial law conditions. We're going to need the U.S. military to effectively disperse all of these crowds. And we're going to have to, fight against MAGA supporters the same way the military fights against an insurgency force. We're going to need a sort of military counterinsurgency state, which will be imposed across the country, just as they, did around January 6, 2017, when the military, turned D.C. into effectively a military-occupied territory. And, anyone who was there, who lived through January 2017, knows what that feels like. There are men with assault rifles. There are large military Humvees on every street corner. There's barbed wire. There's smoke in the air. The whole thing feels like, like you don't even want to, put a Post-it note on the wall that says what your political beliefs are, because, you feel what people in Baghdad or people in Fallujah surely felt when the U.S. military came there. If you're on the wrong side of the U.S. installed regime, then you're staring at the barrel of the gun that that is now going to do this sort of martial law period until the insurgency is quelled, and then they can return to a Justice Department run legal system. Now it totally depends, I think, on how things go down next week, because if Trump wins a massive electoral college victory, if he gets 300 electoral votes, this is going to be much harder to do because you're going to have 2 months of narrative setting about the size of the mandate. And this apparatus that is doing this is a blob apparatus. It's a foreign policy establishment because they hate Trump's foreign policy on Eurasia, because they have trillions of dollars on the line between Goldman and JP Morgan and BlackRock and that whole financial corporate world that sponsors the Biden-Harris world. And so they want Trump to be, they want to avoid Trump becoming president and stop him because he could undermine this very fragile, very lucrative in-process operation to acquire all that if he decides to be neutral with Russia as opposed to maximum pressure. So what the issue is, though, if they just completely strong arm this and do it ham-fistedly, the international blowback could be tremendous. Other countries around the world are going to be watching the daily ups and downs of the next 2 months. And our entire linchpin of statecraft is based on democracy promotion. Already, I think the State Department's democracy promotion apparatus has been weakened by the questions around the legitimacy of the 2020 election. We saw, Bukele in El Salvador question them. We saw Bolsonaro in Brazil question them. We saw, Orban in Hungary question them. We saw even questions from Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage in Western Europe. Things are already on edge about the legitimacy of the U.S. election process, and that damages our ability to translate our democracy promotion programs into effective statecraft when other people think that our system is not legitimate. So what they're going to do is they're going to need to see the narrative on this. And this is why you saw these letters to Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson and Steven Crowder and all these folks warning them not to delegitimize a potential Kamala Harris win under shady circumstances next week or in January, you name it, because they'll be demonetized if they do. You'll be removed from the YouTube partner program. This is what they did last time in 2020. They ran something called the Transition Integrity Project, where they worked with all the legacy news outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. They literally had a delegation sent to all of them. They gave them all the talking points. They got written commitments about the exact terms they would use to cover the election process and the various contingent outcomes. Trump wins on election day. Trump wins on election day, but then loses to Joe Biden, the so-called red mirage, blue shift. So they are surely running that program back in the background while simultaneously working with the social media companies to try to ensure that they can get control over perceptions of legitimacy, because perceptions of legitimacy will determine how many pieces they can deploy on the chessboard to orchestrate a potential coup.
Well, that brings me to election integrity. We're obviously less than a week before the election, and we have examples from Virginia. We have examples from Michigan. We have examples from Washington State, from Nevada, from Arizona, from Georgia, all of these different, and of course, almost every state that I've named is a swing state. Oftentimes, these things are happening in swing counties of swing states. The Colorado Secretary of State said there's been a ballot fraud ring that has been caught, quote unquote, intercepting ballots, but the ones that have already been cast fraudulently are still going to count towards the final tally of the election. I mean, these things are already, there were the ballot boxes that were burning in Vancouver, Washington State, people that had already cast their ballots. This stuff is going to impact the outcome of the election. That's just the stuff that we're seeing, not the things that we haven't seen yet. Mark Elias is waging his lawfare, trying to, I think it's in Nevada, where if a mail-in ballot is delivered up to 3 days after the election without a postmark, it's still counted. Banana stuff, obviously unfair stuff. What do you see the state of election integrity being for the 2024 election?
It's hard because the other side has sharpened its lawfare knife to such a fine edge. And they've, this 65 project thing is very nasty, where they personally went after all 65 attorneys who played a role in litigating election integrity lawsuits during the 2020 election cycle in order to sue them personally, to get them disbarred, to bankrupt them, to force them to mortgage their homes. And John Eastman got disbarred. Rudy Giuliani got disbarred. They've done this to Jeff Clark and 65 others. And so there's a question of how much lawyers are going to be willing to go to bat this time around, given what was done last time. But the nice thing is this time, there's actually a lot of high-level capital that's flowed into the Trump campaign that may be able to support legal funds for those lawyers. Elon Musk's entry into this, for example, is a game changer. He set up the America PAC. You have a suite of Silicon Valley investors, as you mentioned. Even Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg have sidelined the traditional money or political support that typically goes to the other side on this. And so there's a question about whether or not lawyers on the Trump side will be emboldened by the perception of a support network to allow them to litigate this. But there's also the open issue about what the Supreme Court will do about these cases. So last time, one of the secret weapons to all of it last time was the street paramilitary presence, the pervasive street paramilitary presence of BLM and Antifa and the Sunrise Movement and these climate core militias, in order to threaten the country into total destabilization, shutdown of the federal highways, occupation of federal buildings, Molotov cocktails in police cars, burning down police precincts, surrounding the White House. There was a chilling anarcho-tyranny that was on the tip of everyone's tongues as Election Day rolled around last time. And the threat of its overhang to come back on Inauguration Day, if Trump were inaugurated, I think made an impact on the perception of judges that if they made a pro-Trump ruling, the country could be set into chaos. Now, there's an unsubstantiated rumor, and I don't know if it's true, but that at the Supreme Court, that Chief Justice Roberts articulated something of that nature to Clarence Thomas in debating whether or not to grant cert to Donald Trump's appeal to have his election integrity cases heard by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court denied cert 7-2, with basically two conservatives, but then wanting to hear the election integrity cases, but then two of the conservatives who Trump appointed actually declined cert. Kavanaugh and Barrett both declined cert to even hear the election integrity issues that Donald Trump's lawyers had prepared. There's an open question, given how brave the Supreme Court has been, I think, this time around. They knocked out affirmative action, Grutter versus Bollinger this year. That was a huge, bold move by them. They knocked out Roe v. Wade this year, the abortion law that had been in the law of the land for decades. It's quite possible that they, like Bezos, may actually be willing to hear these election integrity lawsuits, unlike last time, and actually give a venue to disputing them. We just saw, for example, the Supreme Court just crushed the Justice Department's attempt just this week. Virginia passed a law purging 1,500 illegal, self-confessed illegal immigrants non-citizen voters from the voter rolls. Merrick Garland's crooked Justice Department then intervened and forced the illegal voters to be put back on the rolls. But the Supreme Court heard the appeal from the state of Virginia and just shut the Justice Department down. If they do that this time, it could be a game changer from what we had last time.
I hope so. I think, too, the American people, even if you are not a Trump supporter, even if you are not a Republican, maybe you're independent, maybe you're centrist, maybe you're non-political, maybe you're even a Democrat, you're just not a woke leftist. People understand more what happened in 2020 than ever before. People understand that Joe Biden is corrupt, that the woke left is breaking the rules, and they're more open-minded. I mean, a lot of people, even if they're not on the right yet, even if they're not conservative, they have been red-pilled in the sense that they know the media lies to them, and they're a little more willing to think for themselves. So I think that's a protective layer around cheating as well. Blatant cheating, they won't be able to get away with as blatant of cheating when people are as aware of it as we are going into this election. Mike Benz, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you on X?
At Mike Benz Cyber. I am prolific on there, posting videos, analysis, lectures. So thanks so much, Liz. Always great to talk to you.
And I can confirm that he's one of the most active X followers that I follow. He's worth a follow, though, guys. Mike, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Liz.
All right, guys, thank you for watching today. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, even though they're probably going to censor a lot of this conversation. If they do censor it, go to blazetv.com/Liz. Join us over there. That's what we're about at The Blaze. We're about free speech, and every conversation that we have is protected over there. You can go to Spotify and Apple, and you can subscribe there as well. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.